Hi, this is Chris with Logos Apologia, depends on your Greek. This is a response to CrazyPills, who answered the resurrection challenge. And hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to make a video in response and to give me your thoughts. And I know it takes some effort, and I really do appreciate your opinions. I do have, of course, some points to address. And let's see, I got some notes here. Fact one, you took issue with, you said, that the tomb was probably empty, but that the body was stolen. Makes more sense than resurrection. Okay. Well, one thing I wanted to address right off the bat. You mentioned that you thought I was looking for one answer that explains all the facts. That's not really a requirement. What I pointed out was that the resurrection does explain all the facts, and individual explanations, that's certainly possible. But the thing is they have to be coherent, and that's really what we're going to examine. It's easy to offer an explanation for each of the 5 facts, but what is challenging is to have a coherent explanation. And I think that's where a lot of the skeptics make mistakes. They think that because they answer each point independently, that somehow accounts for the evidence, and it really doesn't. And I'm going to try to demonstrate how that works. Christian apologists have used the evidence from Matthew where it says that the guards were at the tomb. I didn't make that argument because I really don't think it's necessary. And the reason being is that, in the 2nd century, the earliest known polemic against the empty tomb that we know of was from Jewish sources, and they said the disciples stole the body. And so we have that from a hostile source. But implicit in the claim that the disciples stole the body is a tacit admission that the tomb was empty. So it's actually evidence for the empty tomb. But when it really comes right down to it, our case isn't built on the empty tomb. It's just one piece of the evidence. The disciples' belief in the resurrection was due to appearances. Paul's belief was due to an appearance. James's belief was due to an appearance. So the empty tomb is just another piece of supporting evidence in the whole picture. But to say that the body was stolen isn't really coherent because it doesn't explain the appearances. So for that, you offer another explanation. And so that gets us to fact 2, where, you took some time to do some research and you came up with all these different sorts of bias that, can account for hallucinations. And I think you're right. A lot of older people especially will claim that they've seen their dead wife the night after they died, and there's very good sound psychological reasons to expect that these are perhaps hallucinations. And there's a lot of good documented cases of that. But false memories, confirmation biases, all these things that you listed, I'll give you that those things exist, but the problem, again, is coherence. That might explain somebody like Peter or John who loved Jesus. They did have an expectation. They didn't want him to be dead. They had staked their lives on Jesus' teaching. But see, someone like Paul hated it. Paul was killing Christians. He was hunting them down. His mission in life was to rid the countryside of these people. He had no bias whatsoever. His bias was the opposite direction. He didn't want to see Jesus. He didn't expect to. He thought it was all bunk. James thought his brother was crazy. He didn't have an expectation to see to see a vision of Jesus or hallucinate Jesus. So the problem with the hallucination story, it's not coherent with all the evidence. You can make it fit somebody like Peter, but that is, it fails to explain the whole gamut of the evidence. So if it fails at that, it just fails. So it doesn't explain it. And the appearances of Jesus go right back to the time of the events. And I have a video that I did on the creed. It's in 1 Corinthians 15. And I'll post a link to that. And there's really good reasons to believe that goes back to within 2 years of Jesus' death. Now, the next thing you do, which I found pretty interesting, is you did a chart of the Gospels. Now, my argument wasn't based on the Gospels. The Gospels are independent attestation. I did say that. But, what's interesting to me is that I have other skeptics on here, trying to make a claim that all the Gospels are basically only count as one source and things like that. That you go to great lengths to demonstrate their differences in the accounts, which I think actually proves the point that they are independent attestations. So I think you've done me a favor in that regard, because some of the things you do are a little bit misguided or misrepresentations, in that, like in your first column across the first row, it says who went first to the tomb, and you show that one says Mary, one says different numbers of people, but no one ever says only. Like, I noticed at the last one you got to John, you says John only says Mary. But the word only is not there. John says Mary, set out for the tomb. The fact that he didn't mention the other people doesn't mean they weren't there. He didn't use the word only. And so, if you notice, there's a core. Mary is in all of them. So some of the writers included all three, some didn't. That's, that doesn't prove that there's a contradiction. That just shows that, they just had a different purpose in their writing. One's emphasizing a different thing than the other. And, there's a core truth to all the accounts. And all the things that you did, you can show minor differences. And what that shows me is that we have different perspectives, different people telling the story. But through all of those different perspectives, you can extract a core truth. There's a story that's coherent through all of their accounts. No matter what they might have the details, one might have seen 2, one might have seen 3. But where 3 are, 2 are also. It just depends on what angle you're looking at. Or, so, there's good answers for all these alleged contradictions, but I'm really not trying to get into all that. That's really not the purpose. But, the fact is, if you go to court and you have 2 or 3 witnesses come up and tell precisely the same story, like to the point where they get everything in the small details, you expect that they've colluded, that they've gotten together and fabricated the story. The fact that we see these differences, the points that you bring out, actually supports the idea that we have different perspectives from different people, yet there's a core historical story that can be extracted from all of them that is the same, and it's coherent. And that's really what's important. And that's the kind of thing that historians do all the time. Most of our ancient stories, they don't believe everything they read, about Julius Caesar or any of these guys, but they go through the stories and they extract a historical core. And so, if we don't have to look at inerrancy or any of those things, even with all those differences that you point out, there's a historical core there. And, that's what the minimal facts argument's all about. And I think really what you've done is demonstrated independent attestation more than anything else. As far as your points on Paul, now, there's been like a lot of scholars on the skeptical side of the fence that have even made these claims where Paul didn't even believe in a historical Jesus. And I don't think you're going that far, but I'm going to touch on that just a little bit. But, Paul did see Jesus. And, I don't expect you to know the Bible very, as well as someone who studies it all the time who's a Christian. But, if you look at other scriptures, it's pretty clear that Paul believed that the resurrection body was a real physical body. And I'll just point out some verses where Paul says that. But right there in 1 Corinthians 15, in the Creed, he said, died, buried, raised. That means died, buried, raised. What was buried was raised. If you look at verses 42 through 44 of that same chapter, 15, Paul uses a metaphor of a seed 4 times. It's sown, it's raised, it's sown, it's raised. What goes down in burial comes up in resurrection. He's not talking about just a spiritual vision. But more importantly, this is the verse I was hinting at there, that Paul writes that when Christ returns, that he will transform our lowly bodies so they will be like his glorious bodies. And that's in Philippians chapter 3, verse 21. So he could have easily said that we'd be like Jesus' glorious spirit, but instead he uses the word body. He clearly says our lowly bodies, he's speaking about the future resurrection, will be transformed to be like his glorious body. So it's right there. You know, if you look at what Paul believed, and then we're talking about coherence, you have to look at all of Paul's letters and what Paul believes. Paul did not think Jesus was this mystical vision apparition, the way some people like to claim. You know, he talked about Jesus in the flesh many times. In Galatians 4:4, Paul mentions Jesus' birth. In Romans 1:3, according to the flesh. 2 Corinthians 5:16, we know Christ after the flesh. Romans 9:5, according to the flesh. Paul clearly believed in a historical, fleshly Jesus. He didn't see him as an apparition. That was a later Gnostic belief that is in fact refuted by the Bible. John even calls those people the Antichrist. So those are just some thoughts for you to consider. I think that you know, you've made an effort, but the thing you have to do is when you offer independent explanations, they have to be coherent with the evidence, and the kind of ad hoc way of addressing each point with an alter, you have to have coherence, and you fail to do that. But I do appreciate your effort, and thank you very much.